When we imagine weddings today, we often think of love of heartfelt vows. Long walks down aisles lined with flowers and two people choosing one another out of mutual affection. But in the medieval world, this image would have seemed not only foreign, but potentially laughable. For the vast majority of people living in the Middle Ages, marriage was never about love. It wasn't about personal happiness, companionship, or romantic compatibility. It was a transaction, a business deal, negotiated between families, and sometimes strangers, where the bride and groom were little more than pieces on a larger chessboard. Especially among the nobility and wealthier classes, marriage was an economic and political tool. It was a method of consolidating land, forming alliances, gaining titles, securing dowries, and increasing influence. The people getting married were rarely consulted. In many cases, they had never even spoken to each other before the day of the wedding. And in some arrangements, they didn't even meet until the ceremony itself, when they were handed off like cattle dressed in ceremonial garments, smiling politely while barely knowing the name of the person beside them. This cold reality was particularly brutal for women. A noble woman might have been promised in marriage from the moment she was born. Fathers, brothers, and male guardians controlled her fate, and she had little say in the matter. Her value was often calculated based on what she could bring to the union: a parcel of land, a significant dowry, or the political usefulness of her family name. And unlike the romantic tales of knights wooing ladies, these unions were not inspired by grand gestures or declarations of affection. They were determined. Over long negotiations with parchment and signatures, and sometimes a bag of coins changing hands. Love, if it ever came, was a coincidence, not an expectation. In fact, marrying for love was sometimes considered dangerous. To let emotions override duty could ruin alliances, disrupt family plans, and even cause feuds. A woman who refused a politically useful match because she had fallen for a poor knight or local craftsman might be punished, disowned, or even confined. The very idea that two people would choose each other just because they wanted to be together was considered foolish, naive, and irresponsible. Among the peasantry, things were not quite so strategic, but marriage still wasn't romantic in the way we think of it. For rural families living off the land, survival was the driving force behind everything, including who one married. A peasant family might look to neighboring farms or villages for matches that would ensure access to additional land, labor, or livestock. Marrying someone who could bring a strong pair of arms to the family field was more valuable than someone who was handsome or charming. And in communities where the entire village knew everyone else, love had little room to bloom in secret. Matches were made based on practical needs, and elders often made those decisions on behalf of their children. Love, again, was an afterthought. If it grew, it was welcomed, but no one waited around hoping for butterflies. Life was too short and too hard for that. The church had a somewhat paradoxical role in all of this. On the one hand, Christian doctrine insisted that marriage was a sacred bond, a holy union between a man and a woman, and that consent was necessary for the marriage to be valid. Technically, both bride and groom had to say yes of their own free will for a marriage to be considered legitimate in the eyes of the church. But in practice, this ideal was often steamrolled by social pressure, family dominance, and economic necessity. If a girl refused to marry the man chosen for her, her no could be interpreted as confused or emotionally unstable. Her parents might still proceed with the union, confident that the priest would overlook any hesitation. The church's consent requirement, while noble in theory, had very little power in a society that expected obedience and punished dissent, especially from women and children. And while church authorities occasionally stepped in to annul marriages under extreme circumstances, they were more often interested in keeping order than protecting individuals. The transactional nature of marriage extended to the very language people used. In medieval England, a wedding was often referred to as a joining or a making. as if the couple were parts of a larger machine. Contracts were signed. Witnesses were required. Sometimes there was no religious ceremony at all, only a verbal agreement made in front of others and sealed with a symbolic gesture, such as the exchange of tokens or a kiss. It wasn't until the later Middle Ages that the church began requiring weddings to take place inside churches with priests officiating. Before that, a marriage could be considered valid simply if two people said they were married and consummated the union. This created a gray area that was ripe for abuse, confusion, and manipulation. A man might claim a woman as his wife simply by saying she had agreed, and she, if too poor or powerless to contest it, would be stuck down. It's also important to understand that the social consequences of marriage, especially for women, were immense. A married woman became the legal property of her husband in most aspects of life. She lost her maiden name, her legal independence, and often her inheritance rights. Her body, her labor, and her future children were now under the control of her husband and his family. She was expected to obey, to serve, and to bear children. Whether she loved her husband or even liked him was considered irrelevant. The goal was to produce heirs, manage the household, and uphold the family's reputation. A woman who failed to do so by being infertile, outspoken, or rebellious could find herself abandoned, beaten, or accused of witchcraft. And there was no divorce. Marriage was, for most women, a lifelong assignment. Men did not fare much better in some cases. A poor man who married above his station might be viewed with suspicion, jealousy, or outright hostility. If he failed to provide for his wife, he could be ridiculed or punished. If he was caught in adultery, he might be forgiven, but if his wife strayed, the consequences were often far more severe. In noble circles, the pressure to produce heirs could be suffocating, and men were expected to enforce discipline, manage estates, and control their households without appearing weak or lenient. In this environment, love was not only impractical, it could be dangerous. To care too deeply might make a man vulnerable. It could be seen as a sign of weakness or even madness. Even the imagery of marriage was transactional. In many wedding ceremonies, symbolic objects were exchanged to represent what each party was giving and receiving. A groom might present a coin, a ring, or a piece of land to the bride, or, more accurately, to her father. The bride might bring a dowry of household items, livestock, or food. These exchanges were not sentimental. They were records of ownership, proof of agreement, and physical reminders that this union was built on mutual gain, not affection. In this light, a medieval wedding resembled a marketplace more than a celebration dock. It's no surprise then that many people dreaded marriage. Young girls cried when told they were to be wed. Peasant boys ran away from arranged matches. Monks and nuns renounced marriage altogether, seeking peace and celibacy. And while ballads and romances idealized love and courtship, these were considered escapist fantasies, harmless distractions, not blueprints for real life. In practice, medieval marriage was a duty. It was work. It was the beginning of a contract that shaped the rest of one's life. And often, it was a horrible dot in the end. The horrible truth about medieval weddings is not just that they were loveless or forced or economically cold. It's that they reflected the structure of a society that valued property, lineage, and control far above individual feelings. Weddings weren't about the couple. They were about families, about alliances, about managing the chaos of life through structure and sacrifice. And for most, it was simply the next step in a life already dictated by others. The bride and groom didn't walk into a new life. They were led into it, quietly, politely, with everyone watching. If there's one aspect of medieval weddings that modern audiences find particularly disturbing, it is the simple, inescapable fact that many brides were, by today's standards, children, not young women, not teenagers, children. In many parts of medieval Europe, it was perfectly normal and encouraged, even for girls to be married off shortly after reaching puberty. And sometimes they were betrothed even earlier, when they were just 6 or 7 years old. These were not symbolic or ceremonial engagements either. These were real contracts, binding agreements often sealed with money, land, or livestock. The girl's future was determined before she had even learned how to write her name, before she had any sense of what life might offer outside of her family's control. Her wedding day was decided years in advance, and all she could do was wait. In the medieval mind, childhood didn't exist in the way we think of it today. There was no long stretch of adolescence, no teenage years filled with personal discovery or independence. A child was seen as a small adult. The moment a girl reached puberty, she was considered physically ready for marriage and therefore ready for the responsibilities of womanhood. But readiness was measured biologically, not emotionally. If her body could bear children, then she was deemed old enough to be a wife, a mother, and a servant in someone else's household. It didn't matter whether she understood the rituals, the vows, or the meaning behind the marriage. What mattered was that she could fulfill her role. This attitude was particularly prominent among the nobility. For noble families, marriage was a strategic game, and daughters were pawns to be placed carefully. A girl's value diminished with age. The younger she was, the more pure she was considered, both in terms of chastity and economic potential. Her ability to bear many children, to form a long-lasting alliance, to be molded into the ideal wife, all of this depended on getting her married early. A girl of 16 might already be considered a late bloomer. A girl of 20 could be seen as a burden, and so the arrangements were made early, often with disturbing eagerness. Fathers negotiated dowries. Mothers packed trunks. Priests blessed unions. And through it all, the girl stood silently. Her fate wrapped in cloth and custom dot in some recorded cases. Girls were married at the age of 12 or 13. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval era, was married to Louis VII of France when she was just about 15. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, was married at 12 and gave birth to her only child at 13. While not every marriage was consummated immediately, many were. And the physical toll this took on young brides was immense. Childbirth was dangerous for adult women in the Middle Ages. For a girl whose body was still developing, it could be deadly. Many young brides died in childbirth, or from infections and complications that followed. Others survived but were left physically damaged for life. Even when consummation was delayed, the psychological burden was heavy. A child married off to a much older man, sometimes decades older, was expected to obey, to serve, to accept her place without question. There were no support systems, no schools to flee to, no legal protections. Her life now belonged to her husband and his family. Her role was fixed. She was to be a good wife, a fertile woman, a loyal subject. Her opinions were irrelevant. Her wishes, if she dared to express them, were often met with scorn or punishment. The very idea that she might want something different, she might dream of a future not defined by marriage, was considered laughable, or worse, dangerous. Among the lower classes, the age of marriage varied more. Peasant families often waited until a girl could contribute to the household, either through labor or childbearing. But even here, early marriage was common. Girls might be married at 14 or 15, especially if it meant securing help. On the farm, access to another family's resources, or relief from having another mouth to feed. In villages where survival was a constant struggle, marrying off a daughter was seen as practical. Sometimes it was even celebratory. A wedding meant less burden. It meant an alliance. It meant progress. But make no mistake, this was not freedom. A young girl might go from one home of hard labor to another. She might be handed to a man she barely knew, expected to serve his parents, his siblings, and him with absolute obedience. There were no honeymoons, no gentle transitions. One day, she was a daughter. The next, a wife. And sometimes, a mother before her body was truly ready. If she failed in any of these roles, if she was slow to conceive, if she spoke out of turn, if she resisted her duties, she could be punished, scorned, or even cast aside. Some girls were returned to their families in disgrace, as if they were defective goods. The church, once again, played a strange double role in all this. Officially, the age of consent for marriage under canon law was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These were minimum ages, not ideal ones, but they set the tone. As long as both parties agreed and the marriage was consummated, it was valid. Priests often turned a blind eye to age differences, so long as the marriage was politically or socially useful. While some church leaders did speak out against the marrying of very young girls, arguing that they were not spiritually mature enough, these voices were rare and often drowned out by the weight of tradition. In some communities, girls were married off so young that they didn't even understand what marriage meant. They simply wore the clothes, repeated the words, and followed the hands that guided them. One of the most haunting aspects of this system was its invisibility. Medieval people rarely questioned it. They accepted it as part of life, as natural, as necessary, as good. Stories of young brides suffering, crying, or even dying were met with resignation. It was simply the way things were. And for the girls themselves, there were few tools to resist. To protest a marriage was to defy one's family, one's community, and the church. It was seen as rebellious, shameful, or even heretical. A girl who ran away from an arranged marriage might be hunted down, dragged back, and forced to submit. In some cases, she might be sent to a convent, but only if she was lucky and her family could afford. There were exceptions, of course. Some girls did find kindness in their husbands. Some couples grew to love one another. Some noble women managed to leverage their positions into real power later in life. But these stories were rare, and they were never the norm. For most girls in medieval Europe, marriage meant the end of childhood. It meant submission. It meant risk. And often it meant silence. Silence in the face of pain. Silence in the face of fear. Silence as they were led down the aisle. Not toward a future they chose, but toward destiny. Written by others in a world where girls were expected to marry before they had the chance to imagine anything else. It's no wonder that so many disappeared into their roles without a trace. Their stories were not recorded. Their names were not remembered. Their dreams, if they had any, were buried beneath dowries and duty. And that is perhaps the most horrible truth of all, that a medieval wedding was not the beginning of a joyful union, but the quiet erasure of a young girl's voice, hidden behind the veil, never to speak freely again when we speak of marriage. Today, the idea of consent is not just central, it is sacred. The notion that two people should choose each other, freely and with understanding, has become so ingrained in our expectations that it's hard to imagine marriage functioning without it. But in the medieval world, things were far less clear. Consent was technically required by canon law, yes. The church insisted that both the bride and the groom had to say yes for a marriage to be valid. But that little word yes did not always mean what we think it means. In practice, consent was a murky and fragile concept. A word that could be coerced, assumed, or simply fabricated by someone else. Consent in medieval marriages, especially for women, was often a legal formality layered over deep, silent pressure. In many cases, it wasn't freely given at all. It was simply expected to understand the confusion around medieval consent. We must first understand how the church defined marriage. By the 12th century, church doctrine had begun to define marriage as a sacrament, a sacred bond blessed by God and governed by the clergy. According to canon law, a valid marriage required mutual consent and consummation. In other words, both people had to agree to be married, and they had to physically act. On that agreement, without either, the union could be challenged or annulled. This rule was revolutionary in theory. It placed individual will above family arrangements. But theory rarely matched reality in practice. The people getting married were not usually in control of their own decisions. Noble families arranged marriages for their children long before the age of consent. A young boy might be pledged to a young girl when they were both infants. The agreement might be sealed with a contract, a blessing, and perhaps a symbolic gift. Once the children reached legal age, the marriage would be formalized. At that point, their consent was usually nothing more than a ritual. A nod, a repeated phrase, a whisper in front of a priest. The real negotiations had already taken place behind closed doors between fathers, uncles, and lords. The couple, especially the bride, was simply expected to go along with it. And what happened if someone refused to say yes? What if a bride wept, stayed silent, or said no? Here, things become more unsettling. Silence, in many cases, was interpreted as consent. If a girl stood quietly, even if she was trembling or crying, the priest might continue the ceremony. If she nodded under pressure, it was considered agreement. A spoken no could be dismissed as fear or modesty. In fact, medieval legal texts and sermons often debated whether a bride's refusal could be trusted after all. Wasn't it natural for a girl to resist out of shyness or virtue? Wasn't it common for a good woman to feign reluctance? These were not rhetorical questions. They were real debates, and they allowed a culture of forced or assumed consent to flourish. Family pressure played a massive role in these situations. Daughters were expected to obey their fathers without question. Sons, too, could be punished for resisting an arranged marriage. A father might threaten to withhold a dowry, cut off inheritance, or send a disobedient child to a convent or monastery. In noble houses, the consequences could be even more dramatic. A disobedient daughter could be locked away, shamed publicly, or forcibly married without warning. There were recorded cases of girls being dragged to the altar, surrounded by armed guards or family retainers, and forced to go through with the ritual. And once the vows were spoken and the marriage consummated, the union was almost impossible to undo, even among peasants. Where marriage arrangements were less political, pressure still loomed large. Families relied on marriages to create alliances, share labor, and ensure survival. A child who resisted marriage might bring shame or hardship upon their household. It was often easier to go along with the match than to resist, especially when resistance meant public humiliation or beatings. And so consent became a performance. A nod, a smile, a whispered yes, spoken, with the weight of generations behind. Sometimes, that was all it took. There were, however, people who tried to resist. Some girls ran away before their weddings. Some couples eloped, seeking to marry secretly without parental approval. These were often referred to as clandestine marriages, and they presented a real problem for both families and the church. On the one hand, the church had to uphold its doctrine. If two people consented and consummated, they were married, even without witnesses. On the other hand, this loophole allowed rebellious unions that ignored family arrangements and social hierarchy. Over time, church authorities began cracking down on these secret weddings, requiring bans to be announced in church and weddings to be conducted publicly in front of witnesses and clergy. But enforcement was uneven, and the problem persisted. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval consent is how it intersected with sexual expectations. Once a marriage was declared valid, the wife was expected to submit to her husband's will. In the eyes of the church, marital sex was not only permitted, it was required. Refusing one's spouse could be grounds for annulment. A husband had the legal and religious right to demand consummation, and a wife who resisted could be accused of sin or rebellion. The idea that a woman had a right to bodily autonomy within marriage was almost non-existent. This meant that any coerced marriage quickly became a life sentence. Once she said yes, even under pressure, she belonged to her husband in almost every sense. Her body, her labor, her identity. The courts occasionally recognized abuses of consent, but only under very specific circumstances. If a bride could prove that she had been threatened, tricked, or physically forced into marriage, the union might be annulled. But proof was hard to come by, and the burden fell entirely on the woman. She had to convince male clerics and judges that her voice had not been freely spoken. In many cases, families worked together to suppress such claims. Neighbors stayed silent. Witnesses were bought, and the church more interested in preserving order than protecting individuals, usually sided with the status quo. There were also many instances in which men were victims of forced consent. A boy from a wealthy family might be married off to secure a mother-in-law's dowry or a connection to royal blood. Young boys, barely into adolescence, were sometimes expected to marry and perform their husbandly duties, whether they understood them or not. While their suffering was often overlooked, after all, men were presumed to benefit from marriage. They too were trapped in a system that valued social order over individual choice. And yet, amid all this pressure and pain, there were moments of quiet rebellion. Lovers who ran away. Young women who stood up in court and declared that they had married against their will. Parents who refused to force their children into unions they despised. These stories are rare, hidden in dusty court records and forgotten ballads, but they exist. They remind us that even in the darkest systems, there are sparks of resistance, people who believed, however faintly. In the right to choose, the medieval world was not entirely blind to the concept of love. It flourished in songs, in literature, in the chivalric romances whispered between pages. But that love was often idealized, kept separate from the institution of marriage. To fall in love outside the bounds of one's arranged match was considered scandalous, foolish, even dangerous. Passion belonged in poetry, not in contracts. Real life was too fragile to be shaped by such unpredictable forces, and so medieval weddings went on day after day, year after year, anchored in systems that treated consent as a legal technicality rather than a lived experience. A word spoken under pressure counted just the same as one offered freely. Silence was taken as agreement. Resistance was worn down. The result was a culture in which many people, especially women, entered marriage not with joy or hope, but with resignation. A whispered yes, a forced smile, a future already written by others in the end. The horrible truth about medieval consent is not just that it was misunderstood or manipulated. It's that it was often irrelevant. The machinery of marriage was bigger than any one person. It rolled forward, guided by tradition, economy, and power, sweeping up everyone in its path. To consent was to survive. To refuse was to vanish. And in a world where survival came before all else, most people, quietly, fearfully chose to say yes doubt if there is a single element of medieval marriage that removes all lingering illusions. Of romance, it is the financial arrangement that underpinned nearly every union. Love may have made for good poetry in the Middle Ages, but what really sealed a marriage, what truly mattered, was money. Property, goods, promises, contracts, whether noble or peasant, man or woman, marriage in the medieval world was less of a sacred joining of souls and more of a business deal. A highly strategic, often stressful negotiation between families, where two individuals were exchanged like assets on a ledger. And at the very center of this transaction were two deeply entrenched customs: the dowry and the bride price, though both might appear similar at a glance, money or goods. Exchanged during a marriage, the dowry and bride price served very different purposes, and their existence reflected not just economic realities, but also cultural values about power, property, and control. In some places, both existed simultaneously. In others, only one was used. But the result was always the same. Marriage, for all its ceremonial trappings, was fundamentally about ownership and transfer, not affection. Let's begin with the dowry. The most widespread and well-documented tradition across medieval Europe. A dowry was a collection of money, goods, land, or valuables given by the bride's family to the groom or his family at the time of marriage. This was not a gift. It was more like a payment, a form of economic compensation. In noble families, a dowry could be immense acres of fertile land, bags of silver, fine textiles, livestock, servants, or even entire estates. Among peasants, it might be more modest: a cow, a parcel of tools, a few chickens or sacks of grain. But the principle remained the same. A woman's entry into marriage came at a cost, and her family had to pay it. The reasons behind this custom were many, but they all revolved around control. For the bride's family, the dowry was a way of securing their daughter's future, ensuring she was properly provided for in her new household. It was also a form of social signaling. Wealthier families gave larger dowries to demonstrate their status. A girl with a generous dowry was far more likely to find a good match. Because the dowry wasn't just a gift to the groom, it was a bribe, a financial incentive to take on the burden of a wife. In a society that valued sons far more than daughters, the dowry was also a way of unloading the economic cost of raising a girl. Daughters, after all, could not inherit in many parts of Europe. Their function was to marry and be married off. From the groom's side, accepting a dowry was both a privilege and a responsibility. It meant assuming ownership of the woman, along with her dowry. Her land became his land. Her servants became his. Her money might go toward improving his household or investing in his estate. But with that dowry came expectations. He was to treat her with a certain level of care, or at least not ruin her completely. If he misused her dowry, squandered it, lost it, or spent it dishonorably, he could be challenged by her family or even brought before a court. In this way, the dowry offered a faint line of protection, but one that could easily be ignored or broken if the family lacked influence in some cases. The dowry came with strings attached. A noble woman might bring land into a marriage, but the land could revert to her family if she died childless. Or she might be required to maintain certain religious or social duties to retain access to her dowry's income. If the marriage ended through annulment, abandonment, or death, the woman might try to recover her dowry. But the legal process was slow and biased against her. Often, widows had to fight to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. And if they remarried, the dowry negotiations began all over again. On the other end of the exchange was the bride price, a tradition more common in earlier medieval periods and among certain regions and cultures. The bride price was the reverse of a dowry. Was money or goods given by the groom's family to the bride's family as compensation for losing her? In this model, the woman was understood to be of value to her natal family, an economic contributor, and so her departure needed to be offset. Bride prices were especially common in tribal and Germanic customs, and while the church generally tried to phase them out in favor of the dowry system, they never disappeared completely. The bride price emphasized something that medieval culture rarely said out loud. Women were a form of property. They could be bought, exchanged, compensated for. Their value was not just symbolic, it was literal. A bride with strong arms, good health, and childbearing hips might bring a higher price. A noble woman descended from kings might be worth a fortune. But a poor peasant girl with no land and no dowry, her value was purely domestic. And in many cases, she brought no economic gain at all. Families with many daughters often faced financial ruin trying to marry them all off, which is why so many girls were sent to nunneries instead, not out of piety. But because it was cheaper, marriage contracts spelled all of this out. These weren't poetic letters or hopeful promises. They were legal documents, sometimes dozens of pages long, listing the precise contents of the dowry or the bride price, the conditions of inheritance, the arrangements for widows, the penalties for breach of promise. In some noble marriages, the contracts were negotiated over months, sometimes years, by lawyers, clerics, and messengers. The bride and groom themselves might not be present at all. They were passive parties in a business transaction that affected their entire lives. Among peasants, things were simpler but no less economic. A farmer might offer his daughter to a neighboring family in exchange for shared grazing rights. A local blacksmith might marry off his daughter to the miller's son in return for a cut of the flour profits. These were not love matches. They were strategic partnerships, born of practical need. And when the bride had no dowry to offer, other arrangements were made. She might work as a servant in her future husband's home before the marriage. Or her father might agree to help with construction on the husband's barn. Everything was negotiable, except often the girl's opinion. Sometimes money changed hands simply to confirm the seriousness of the arrangement. A small token, called an ara, might be given by the groom to the bride's family at the time. Of engagement, a sign of good faith. If the marriage fell through, the token was kept as a penalty. These economic gestures reinforced the idea that marriage was not primarily emotional. It was transactional. Failure had a price. Promises had weight. It's worth noting, too, how all this played out for widows. A widow who retained control over her dowry or who had inherited her husband's estate could, in theory, live independently. Some widows became wealthy landowners or even re-entered the marriage market as desirable matches. But they too were subject to renewed negotiations, new contracts, and fresh economic scrutiny. Her second marriage would often depend on whether she still had property, whether she could produce children, and whether she was willing to accept a smaller role than before. The legal mechanisms surrounding dowries and bride prices were deeply entangled with class and gender. Wealthy families could afford lawyers and priests to defend their daughters' rights. Poor families could not. Noble women might see their dowries used to build castles, fund armies, or bribe kings. Peasant women might never even see their dowries. Again, absorbed into their husband's property the moment they crossed the threshold of their new home. And across the board, a woman without a dowry, no matter her beauty, charm, or intellect, was often considered only RRIAGEABLE by the late Middle Ages. The dowry system had become so entrenched that it warped family life entirely. Daughters were raised with the knowledge that their future depended not on their dreams, but on their price. Parents scrimped and saved for years to produce decent dowries, sometimes impoverishing themselves in the process. Younger sons unable to marry, without wealth, often remained single or joined the church. And women who refused to marry or who failed to do so were often labeled as burdens, or even threats to social order. In the end, the medieval wedding was not a celebration of love, it was a contract of exchange. A movement of money, a reshuffling of property, a negotiation where lives were bartered. Two people stood before a priest, yes, but behind them stood generations of financial planning, obligation, and quiet desperation. The dowry was not a token of affection, it was a receipt, a record of transfer, a silent reminder that in marriage, a woman's worth was measured not in joy or happiness, but in what she brought to the table and what could be taken when she was gone. The wedding ceremony wasn't always in a church today. When we think of a wedding, the first image that often comes to mind is a church. A tall ceiling, rows of wooden pews, flickering candles, a robed priest standing at the altar. We picture formal vows exchanged beneath a vaulted roof, with stained glass casting colored light on the scene. It feels sacred, solemn, structured. But in the medieval world, this wasn't always the case. In fact, for much of the Middle Ages, a wedding didn't need a church at all. The earliest medieval marriages happened wherever people happened to be, at a well, in a field, beside a tree, or simply standing in front of two witnesses. And for a long time, that was enough. This might seem surprising today, given the power the church eventually came to wield over people's personal lives. But for the first several centuries of the medieval period, the church was more concerned with baptisms, deaths, and confession than it was with weddings. Marriage, at least at the beginning, was largely considered a private affair. It was something agreed upon by families, recognized by neighbors, and declared in public. The priest might bless the couple afterward, but his presence wasn't required to make the union valid. All that truly mattered, at least according to early canon law, was that the couple agreed to be married and then consummated the union. That's it. A verbal agreement followed by sexual intercourse. No rings, no altar, no choir singing. Because of this, many early medieval weddings took place in very unceremonious locations. A common spot was the village well, a symbol of life and continuity. Other couples might marry under a favorite tree on the boundary, between two properties, or even at the threshold of the bride's house. This last location became particularly symbolic. In many customs, the couple would marry at the bride's door, And the moment she stepped over the threshold into the groom's household, she was no longer part of her old family. She belonged to a new one. This stepping over the threshold wasn't just literal, it was legal and social, a crossing from girlhood to womanhood, from daughter to wife. Often, these ceremonies were attended by just a handful of people, usually family members, close neighbors, or village elders. The bride and groom would state their intention to marry in a clear and public voice. They might exchange tokens, a coin, a cup, a belt, or a ring if one could be afforded. These gestures weren't sentimental. They were symbolic acts of legal agreement. Once witnessed, the couple was considered married, and their union was treated as fully valid. There might be a feast afterward, with some music and dancing if people had the energy and the means. But as for robes, incense, choirs, and candles, not always, and not necessarily. Even in noble circles, the idea of a marrying without a church ceremony was not unusual, especially in earlier centuries. Royal marriages were often conducted more like treaties than rituals. A bride might be betrothed by proxy, her father signing documents on her behalf, and then sent to her new husband's court, where the vows might be repeated in private chambers. There were certainly grand weddings too, with processions, gifts, and elaborate feasts. But many noble unions were surprisingly low on religious pomp. The priority was sealing the alliance, not sanctifying the bond. So how did the church become involved? Slowly and reluctantly. For a long time, clergy had little control over the marriage process, and they didn't necessarily like that. Clandestine marriages, where couples ran off and married secretly, were a major concern. There were also problems of inheritance and legitimacy. If a couple claimed they were married but had no witnesses, what happened to their children's rights? What if one partner changed their mind? What if someone else claimed to be married to the same person? These messy situations became increasingly common, and the church saw them as dangerous, not only spiritually, but socially. By the 12th century, church authorities began to push harder for formalized marriage ceremonies. The idea was to bring marriage under ecclesiastical control, to make it not just a social or legal event, but a sacrament. This meant a wedding should ideally be performed by a priest in a church and before witnesses. But change came slowly. Even after church councils began encouraging in-church ceremonies, many people continued to marry informally, especially in rural areas. The church's influence was strongest in cities and noble courts. In the countryside, where priests were few and far between, people often stuck with tradition. Marry where your parents married. Marry where your grandparents married. That meant fields, kitchens, courtyards, and doorways dot to further complicate things. There wasn't even a single standardized ritual for a medieval wedding. Depending on where you lived, the ceremony could look vastly different. In some places, the couple would stand side by side and declare their vows to a crowd. In others, the groom would take the bride's hand and pull her toward him while reciting a specific phrase. In Northern Europe, the tradition of hand fasting involved the tying of the couple's hands together, a symbolic binding that would later influence modern ceremonies. But none of these acts required a priest. The key was the public declaration of intent. That was the moment the marriage became real. This looseness caused plenty of confusion. Couples could claim they were married without proof. Scorned lovers might say they'd been secretly wed. The lines between courtship, betrothal, and actual marriage became blurry. In response, the church launched a series of reforms. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 declared that weddings had to be announced publicly, usually in the parish church, on 3 consecutive Sundays. These announcements, known as the banns of marriage, gave the community a chance to raise objections like existing spouses, consanguinity, or unresolved contracts. After that, the church began requiring that a priest be present at the actual ceremony, but still, enforcement remained inconsistent, and many weddings still happened outside of church walls. There's also the matter of location and weather. In some places, church buildings were too small to hold the entire village. So couples would marry just outside the church door, with the priest standing in the threshold. This wasn't symbolic at first, it was practical. But it soon took on meaning. The idea that marriage began outside, on the steps, and only after the vows could the bride enter the sacred space, reflected the concept of entering into a new holy life. In time, as church buildings grew and more priests were assigned to parishes, it became more common for weddings to move fully inside. But that evolution took centuries. And let's not forget the role of alcohol in these less formal weddings. In many rural villages, the wedding was as much a community drinking event as a legal or religious rite. People gathered to celebrate, eat, and most importantly, drink sometimes to the point of chaos. The actual vows might be uttered half drunkenly or even shouted over noise. In some cases, couples were so intoxicated that they forgot the words and someone had to repeat them on their behalf. In others, disputes broke out mid-ceremony over unpaid dowries, late arrivals, or misbehavior. In places where the church had no authority, no records, and no enforcement, such events still counted. A wedding was a wedding, no matter how sloppy, for some, this informal approach offered freedom. Couples could marry quickly without waiting for a priest or traveling to a town. For others, it was a risk. Without witnesses or formal records, disputes about the validity of a marriage could last for years. Entire legal battles were fought over whether two people had in fact spoken their vows. And women, in particular, were vulnerable. A man might claim to have married a woman only to deny it later. Or he might use vague promises to coerce sex, then disappear. The church tried to intervene, but without consistent ceremonies, enforcement was nearly impossible. By the late Middle Ages, things began to change. Church weddings became more common, especially in wealthier communities. Priests started keeping parish records, writing down names, dates, and agreements. Marriage became not just a religious event, but an administrative one. Civil authorities also stepped in, requiring documents and legal recognition. Over time, the idea of a wedding knot in a church became unusual. But even as late as the 5th-10th century, it was still possible, especially in rural areas, to be married in your own home. In a field or on a roadside with nothing more than spoken words and a handful of neighbors to watch. And so the horrible truth is this. Many medieval weddings lacked the sacredness we now associate with them. They were noisy, chaotic, sometimes drunken affairs. Others were quiet, whispered agreements made in private. Some were conducted by priests in great cathedrals. Others were performed by unlicensed clerics or not at all. There was no uniformity, no clear line between legal and illegal, sacred and secular. It was a time of ambiguity, of traditions clashing with reform, of folk customs woven into the fabric of official doctrine. A time when a wedding could be a grand spectacle or just two hands joined at dusk, with nobody watching but the cows. Noble weddings were lavish and horrifying if you were a peasant in medieval Europe. Marriage was mostly a matter of practicality about cows, coins, and community whispers. But if you belonged to the nobility, marriage was an entirely different beast. It was a spectacle, a declaration of power, a chess move in a grand political game. Noble weddings were massive, expensive affairs, bursting with silk, song, and feasting. They dazzled with gold-threaded garments, overflowing wine barrels, and a long trail of horses, banners, and guests who hadn't bathed in days. But beneath the pageantry and celebration lay something far less charming, a cold, calculated transaction, and sometimes even a horror show dressed in velvet among noble families. Marriage was never about personal happiness. It was about strategy land, titles, inheritance, alliances. Every noble wedding served a political purpose. Who you married could shift the balance of power in a kingdom, unite two rival houses, secure a border, or create heirs with claim to multiple territories. Love, if it existed, was a happy accident. More often, it was ignored. The bride and groom were often strangers, chosen by parents or sovereigns years before they ever laid eyes on each other. Sometimes they met for the first time on their wedding day, and yet they were expected to produce children quickly, and ideally, sons. These weddings were not small. Noble families pulled out all the stops to showcase their wealth and importance. A noble wedding might last several days, even weeks. There were processions through town, ceremonial banquets, religious services, gift exchanges, dances, and tournaments. In one corner, minstrels played flutes and lutes. In another, falconers showed off their birds. Entire pigs roasted over open fires, and servers carried trenchers piled with meats glazed and exotic spices. Guests drank heavily, laughed loudly, and occasionally fought one another when the wine outweighed their manners. It was, on the surface, a grand time, but this splendor came at a terrible cost, especially for the bride. Noble brides were often very, very young, and they were rarely allowed to understand or resist what was happening to them. Daughters of lords and kings were often betrothed before the age of 10 and married off as soon as their bodies were considered ready, usually early around 12 or 13. Their weddings were more about showcasing their family status than celebrating the couple. The bride was paraded through the streets in lavish gowns she could barely walk in, weighed down with furs, jewels, and flowers. Her face powdered and painted to appear both pure and expensive. But no one asked her what she wanted. She was on display, like a prize being transferred from one household to another. The groom was often significantly older. A man of 25 or 30 might marry a girl half his age. Sometimes the groom had never met her. Sometimes he was simply fulfilling the will of his king or his father. Either way, the imbalance of age, experience, and power was profound, and the consequences were, frankly, cruel. Once the ceremony was complete, the bride was expected to consummate the marriage regardless of her age or understanding. Whether the wedding night took place in a castle chamber, a manor, or on a fine bed of embroidered linen. The outcome was the same. The girl was expected to endure, and often silently. There are records, chilling ones, that describe the practice of witnessed consummation. In some cases, especially among royalty, the consummation of the marriage had to be proven. Servants, clerics, or members of the family would wait outside the chamber door and listen. Some might even examine the bed sheets for blood, a grotesque tradition meant to prove the bride's virginity. In other instances, they required the bride and groom to lie in bed while observers stood by, watching the beginning of the union before leaving them alone. While this was not the norm everywhere, it occurred often enough to be a documented practice. And it speaks volumes about how little privacy, dignity, or consent noble brides were allowed. The political weight behind noble weddings meant they came with enormous pressure. A noble woman who failed to produce an heir quickly enough might be cast aside, confined to a convent, or blamed for her husband's misfortunes. A groom who failed to perform his marital duties might be mocked or even challenged in court. Entire dynasties could rise or fall depending on the fertility of a young bride who barely understood what had happened to her. And when that bride died in childbirth, as many did, she was mourned publicly, but replaced quickly. The political machine kept turning. Noble weddings also often came with military consequences. A marriage between rival houses might be seen as a peace offering, but it could also reignite long-standing feuds. A spurned suitor might raise an army. A disputed dowry might lead to war. In some cases, the wedding itself was used as a trappa, way to lure an enemy noble into a vulnerable position. It was not uncommon for a marriage feast to end with an arrest, a duel, or a poisoning. And all the while, the young couple at the center of it had no say in any of it. They were chess pieces on a giant board, moved by forces they would never fully understand. Even the feasts themselves could become dangerous or grotesque. Lavish banquets were often designed to shock and impress guests. Entire peacocks were roasted and were dressed in their own feathers. Swans were filled with smaller birds. Some dishes included edible gold leaf, purely to show wealth. Food was abundant, but hygiene was lacking. Guests might eat with unwashed hands, drink from communal cups, and vomit between courses so they could eat more. Tables lacked forks. Bones were tossed on the floor. Dogs roamed freely, fighting over scraps. In some weddings, fire breathers or jesters performed disturbing tricks while drunk guests hurled food or insults at them. It was a loud, chaotic spectacle, and through it all, the bride sat quietly hungry, frightened, and watched. For the nobility, marriage also came with complex legal arrangements. Contracts outlined the exact dowry, inheritance rights, and political promises attached to the union. These documents were long and formal, often negotiated months in advance by lawyers and clerics. If one party violated the terms, say, by refusing to marry or failing to provide the agreed lands, the entire alliance could collapse. Lawsuits could follow. Battles might erupt. And if the marriage was never consummated, either party could demand an annulment. This meant that the marriage wasn't truly complete until the bride had fulfilled her physical role, a brutal expectation placed on someone who may have barely left the nursery dot. It's worth noting that noble women were sometimes sent to live with their future in-laws years before their actual wedding. A girl of 6 or 7 might be removed from her home and raised in a foreign court, taught to speak a different language, eat different food, and obey different customs. By the time she was married at 13 or 14, she no longer even recognized her own family. This form of preparation disguised as education was really a form of conditioning, breaking down the girl's identity and remolding her into a more obedient foreign bride. Not all noble marriages were miserable, of course. Some couples grew to love each other, or at least to respect one another. A handful of noble women managed to assert real influence, particularly widows who outlived their husbands and inherited power. But these were the exceptions. The majority of noble brides were used as tools to secure territory, wealth, or political loyalty, and then expected to fade into the background, producing heirs and keeping quiet. And while the wedding might have been glorious, a parade of silks and trumpets, the life that followed was often one of loneliness, confinement, and fear. A noble bride might live in a cold stone castle, surrounded by strangers, watched by her husband's family, isolated from her own. Her duties were endless: managing servants, hosting guests, keeping accounts, bearing children. If she failed in any of these roles, her position was threatened. And if her husband died, she might be remarried, against her will, to someone even worse. In the end, noble weddings were not fairy tales. They were theatrical transactions where the bride was an object of value, dressed up in jewels and paraded like a prize animal. The music, the food, the laughter, all of it masked a deeper truth. That the girl in the center of the celebration was not beginning a life of freedom or partnership, but entering a contract that cared little for her comfort, her dreams, or her consent. For peasants, weddings were simpler but still harsh when people imagine medieval weddings. The mind often jumps to the glimmering halls of castles, to noble women in velvet gowns and lords with jeweled swords. But the truth is, most people in medieval Europe were not nobles. They were peasants, farmers, shepherds, bachelors, bakers, laborers living lives far from royal courts, in villages tucked among fields and forests. Their weddings, too, were far from grand. They were small, intimate, often hurried. There were no trumpets or feasts for 300. There was no gold, no entourage, and sometimes not even shoes. But make no mistake, peasant weddings, while simpler, were not free of their own hardships, rules, and burdens. The challengers just wore different clothes. Unlike noble unions, which could be negotiated over years and orchestrated across kingdoms, peasant marriages were local affairs. A boy might marry the girl from the next cottage over. A farmer might arrange for his daughter to marry the son of a miller 2 villages away. The reasons were often practical. Marrying within walking distance meant maintaining ties between neighboring households. It meant shared labor, easier transportation of goods, and someone nearby to help when harvests failed or livestock went missing. Most importantly, it meant you didn't leave home. Marriage for peasants was rarely about starting a new life, it was about stitching two old ones together. That said, falling in love was not entirely out of the question. Young men and women often met at markets, during religious festivals, or while working the same fields. They shared chores, passed water jugs, herded animals together, and watched one another from across village gatherings. And sometimes, if they were lucky, this familiarity turned into fondness. But even when affection existed, it was almost never the final word. Peasant marriages still required approval from parents, neighbors, or even the local lord. A father might block a match if he didn't like the boy's prospects. A mother might push for a union with a family that owned more grazing land. And a local landlord might veto a match entirely, particularly if it interfered with obligations to the manor. This wasn't just nosiness. It was survival. A marriage wasn't just about two people. It was a strategic bond between households, and households had to eat. A poorly arranged marriage could mean disaster for a family if the groom had no tools or the bride brought no dowry. The new couple might struggle from day one. If both families were poor, the marriage might actually weaken everyone involved. So families were cautious. They bargained. They weighed pros and cons, and if the young couple disagreed, well, love was rarely a convincing argument. Once a match was approved, the formalities began, but they looked very different from the pomp of noble ceremonies. First came the betrothal, often celebrated in the home or local tavern. This was more than an engagement. It was a binding promise, made before witnesses and often sealed with a drink, a coin, or a simple kiss. Breaking a betrothal could lead to serious consequences: public shame, disputes, even financial penalties. In some cases, betrothal was considered as legally binding as marriage itself, especially if the couple had already consummated the relationship. Then came the wedding itself. A peasant wedding rarely took place inside the church. More often, it happened at the church door, or in a courtyard, or right in a village square. The priest, if present, would say a few words. Vows were exchanged simple, straightforward, and in the vernacular. Rings, if they existed, were plain metal. The bride wore her best dress, which might be patched or borrowed. The groom might wash with care that morning, perhaps even trimming his beard, if he had the time. But there were no choreographed dances, no musicians brought in from other towns. What mattered most was that the union was witnessed, spoken aloud, and recorded if anyone bothered to write it down. And then, just like that, the couple was married. If the family could afford it, there would be a small celebration afterward. This might take place in the bride's home, or under a tree near the fields. Food would be humble: dark bread, cheese, onions, perhaps a little meat if someone had recently slaughtered a pig. Ale would be shared from clay cups. Guests would sing local songs, some of which dated back generations. The bride might be teased by older women who offered grimly humorous advice about married life. Children would run underfoot. Chickens might squawk nearby. And the couple would smile nervously, knowing that tomorrow they'd be up at dawn too. Milk cows, or turn soil, or start building a house of their own. But not all peasant weddings were joyful. Some were arranged hastily to cover a scandal. If a girl became pregnant outside of wedlock, and it was discovered, she might be married off to the father as fast as possible, whether she wanted to or not. If the father refused, he might face fines or public shame. In some cases, both the boy and girl would be paraded through the village, mocked by neighbors, or forced to do penance in church. It didn't matter whether the relationship was consensual. The goal was to restore honor. A hurried marriage might do that, at least on the surface. Worse still, some peasant marriages happened under coercion. A widower might marry a much younger girl to secure help in the home. A struggling family might pressure a daughter to marry a neighbor who could offer better harvest yields. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were considered of marriageable age, and while many waited longer, not all did. The line between choice and obedience was very thin, and the bride's consent, though technically required, was often assumed. Living conditions for newlywed peasants were rarely romantic. Many young couples moved in with one set of parents, usually the grooms, until they could afford their own space. This meant sharing a small, smoky, single-room cottage with grandparents, siblings, and livestock. Privacy was non-existent. Beds were sometimes nothing more than straw pallets tucked beside the hearth. Curtains, if they existed, were old cloth hung from the rafters. The smells of sweat, manure, and old food filled the air. And through all of it, the couple was expected to begin their married life, to share a bed, to bear children, to labor. Side by side, and labor they did. A peasant marriage was not an escape from toil. It was an invitation to more of it. Husbands and wives worked from dawn until dusk. They planted together, harvested together, slaughtered animals together. Wives often did double duty, working in the fields and managing the home, feeding children, spinning wool, brewing ale. There was no leisure, no honeymoon, just life layered with mud, effort, and the slow ticking of seasons. Some couples grew close over time. Others drifted into mutual silence. And some, unable to bear the strain, simply walked away, though divorce was rare and frowned upon. And yet, for all their hardship, peasant weddings carried a kind of raw honesty. They were not buried under silk or silver. They were not inflated with politics or poisoned by dynastic ambition. They were made of necessity and effort, patched together with hope and small joys, a shared loaf of bread, a laugh during milking, a hand extended after a long day's work. These were the quiet, unnoticed threads that held peasant marriages together, not just on the wedding day. But for decades afterward, still, they were far from ideal. Women often died young from childbirth, illness, or the exhaustion of endless labor. Husbands were crushed by carts, kicked by oxen, or taken by fever in the wet months. Children came fast and often. Many did not survive. The home was not always peaceful. Arguments flared. Alcohol blurred tempers. Hunger made people cruel. And yet, the weddings continued season after season, village after village. Because in a world where the future was uncertain, and the present was so often grim, marriage was one of the few ways to find structure, to create a link, to build something, however small, against the tide of time. So no, peasant weddings were not elegant. They did not shine. But they were real, and sometimes, beneath the dirt and the cold and the obligation, they carried the faintest flicker of hope. And for people who had so little, that flicker, however dim, was worth everything. Not the role of the church. Interference. Or blessing? When people think of the medieval church, they often imagine cathedrals towering over villages, monks writing by candlelight, priests muttering Latin behind incense-laced altars. The church was everywhere. They say guiding, judging, recording, and yes, in many ways that was true. But when it came to marriage, the church's role was surprisingly complex, sometimes authoritative, sometimes absent, and often deeply confusing. For much of the medieval period, a marriage could happen with or without a priest, with or without a blessing, with or without a church. But that didn't stop the church from trying to pull the string, blessing what it liked, condemning what it didn't, and inserting itself into people's most intimate moments with all the tact of a blunt axe dot in the earliest centuries of medieval Europe. Marriage was mostly a private agreement. Families decided who married whom, and the couples said their vows aloud before witnesses. That was enough. The church didn't always get involved. In fact, for a long while, it seemed quite content to leave marriage to the laity. Bishops and popes were far more concerned with heresies, politics, and power struggles than they were with whether a farmer's daughter had said, "I do," in front of the proper altar. But as time went on and the church expanded its influence, it began to view marriage as a theological battleground, a way to shape society from the inside out. By the 12th century, the church had made its intentions clear. Marriage was not just a social contract, it was a sacrament. A holy rite like baptism or communion, ordained by God and governed by divine law. This meant that the church claimed spiritual authority over every marriage that took place within Christendom. And once it made that claim, it never looked back. But enforcing this authority was another matter entirely. First, the church had to decide what counted as a marriage. This was harder than it sounds. A couple could say they were married without witnesses, or claim they'd exchanged vows in private years ago. They might have never set foot in a church. No ring, no priest, no feast, just words. Did that count? Surprisingly, yes. The church eventually ruled that consent was the heart of marriage. If two people freely said to one another, "I take you as my husband," and "I take you as my wife," and meant it, they were married, even if no one else heard, even if no one else believed them. This became known as verba de presenti words in the present tense. If you used these, the church considered your union valid. And this decision created a whole host of problems, because suddenly, young lovers could secretly marry without parents, without permission, without preparation. They could slip away, exchange vows beneath a tree or behind a tavern, and return as husband and wife, whether their families liked it or not. And what's worse, they had theological cover. The church, having defined marriage by mutual consent, now had to live with the consequences of that definition. And many of its bishops and priests hated it, so the church tried to clamp down. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council issued new rules. Marriage bans had to be announced publicly. 3 Sundays in a row in the local parish. This was meant to prevent secret weddings and give time for objections to be raised. Maybe the couple were too closely related. Maybe one was already married. Maybe someone owed a dowry. Whatever the issue, the bans were supposed to stop trouble before it started. But in practice, they weren't always followed, especially in small villages where priests were overworked or families were desperate or love had simply gotten. The better of things, the church also insisted that a priest should officiate, that the couple should marry at the church door in daylight before God and man. This was not just for order. It was symbolic. The church door marked a threshold. The couple entered marriage just as they would enter sacred space. It was a beautiful idea, but it wasn't always observed. Some couples couldn't afford the priest's fee. Some lived too far from a church. Some just didn't want the scrutiny. And so the quiet, hidden marriages continued, and the church had to adapt. It developed procedures to investigate marriages. Priests might be called to testify about who was married to whom. Witnesses might be asked whether they'd seen a couple exchanging vows. In some cases, the church required a bed test, sending people to examine whether the couple was sleeping together. If a woman claimed a man had promised marriage and then seduced her, she could bring her case before an ecclesiastical court. And those courts heard thousands of such cases across the medieval period. These church courts didn't just judge marriage, they judged annulments too. If a couple hadn't consummated the union, they could request an annulment. If it turned out they were related within the prohibited degrees of kinship 7 degrees, at one point then the church could declare the marriage null. If one party had been coerced or too young or mentally unfit, it might also be dissolved. The rules were strict and technical, but they often bent in favor of the powerful. Nobles and kings used annulments like tools, discarding inconvenient spouses to marry into better alliances, while commoners were often stuck. And while the church preached the indissolubility of marriage once you were joined forever, it was strangely flexible when it needed to be. Especially if money, land, or royal favor was involved, then there was the question of celibacy and sin. The church taught that marriage was better than burning with lust, but still inferior to chastity. Virginity was ideal. Monks and nuns were held up as holy because they renounced the flesh. Married couples, by contrast, were tolerated. Marriage was a concession to human weakness, not a spiritual triumph. Sex within marriage was allowed, but only for procreation. Too much enjoyment was discouraged, and any non-procreative act, that was sinful, even if the couple was legally wed. This created a tension. The church claimed to honor marriage, but it also looked down on it. Priests offered blessings, yes, but they also delivered sermons on obedience, modesty, and the perils of female temptation. Women were told to submit, men were told to lead. Wives were expected to endure. Husbands were warned not to stray. But enforcement was selective, and sermons often fell on tired ears. Most peasants had neither the time nor the energy to keep up with every shifting rule. They married as best they could and hoped the church wouldn't come knocking. But the church did more than judge it, also recorded. As parishes grew more organized, priests began keeping marriage registers, writing down who was married, when, and where. This gave the church more oversight, but also provided something useful. Proof. If a couple was later accused of fornication, or if someone challenged a child's legitimacy, the register could serve as evidence. Over time, these records helped stabilize communities, providing a paper trail in a largely oral world. Still, for many villagers, the church's involvement felt more like interference than help. Its rules were confusing. Its courts were slow. Its punishments could be harsh. A couple who married without a priest might be fined. A girl who refused an arranged match might be shamed from the pulpit. A man who abandoned his wife could be excommunicated. And for all its talk of holiness, the church itself was often. Priests broke their own vows. Bishops favored the wealthy. And papal dispensations allowing someone to bypass the rules could be bought for the right price. And yet, despite all this, the church provided something that no one else did. A sense of ritual. Even the poorest weddings, if blessed by a priest, had weight. The couple stood before their neighbors, spoke solemn words, and received a sign of divine approval. The priest might anoint them with holy water, say a prayer, and join their hands together in a gesture that stretched back centuries. For a few moments, beneath the open sky or in the chill of a stone chapel, the weight of heaven seemed to press lightly on their shoulders. Some brides wept. Some grooms smiled. A candle flickered. A bell rang. A page in the church's ledger turned, and life, in all its hard and muddy glory, continued. Wedding night expectations, pressure, proof, and privacy lost in modern times. We often think of the wedding night as a moment of privacy, an intimate, personal transition marked by choice and closeness. But in the Middle Ages, that idea would have seemed almost strange. A medieval wedding night was rarely private, rarely gentle, and rarely about intimacy. It was about duty, about proof, and sometimes disturbingly about spectacle. For many couples, especially among the upper classes, the wedding night was not just the beginning of marriage. It was the final requirement. Without it, the marriage could be questioned, annulled, or mocked. And what passed for celebration often masked an experience of profound discomfort, especially for the bride, the moment the wedding ceremony ended. All eyes turned toward the bed, not the flower arrangements. Not the cake, there wasn't one. Not even the feast. It was the consummation that mattered most. In the eyes of the church, in the eyes of law, and in the customs of the time, a marriage was not truly complete until the couple had physically joined. The wedding night was meant to seal the union in flesh, just as the vows had sealed it in word. And for many, this was not optional. It was expected, required, and enforced. This pressure was heaviest on noble couples in high-status marriages, especially those involving land, alliances, or inheritance. The consummation was often witnessed, not directly, but in unsettlingly close ways. In some cultures, attendants would escort the bride and groom to bed, undress them, and say prayers over the sheets. Sometimes, family members remained in the room until the newlyweds were beneath the covers, only leaving once the couple were clearly situated together. In other cases, the proof of consummation came the next morning, when the couple's bed linens were inspected for blood evidence of the bride's virginity. These sheets were sometimes displayed publicly, waved in celebration, or kept as part of the household record. This obsession with proof was rarely about the couple's happiness. It was about property, honor, and legitimacy. A virgin bride was considered unspoiled, both morally and legally. If she was found not to be a virgin, the groom's family might claim they had been deceived. They could demand the return of the dowry. They could even seek annulment. So the pressure to show blood on the sheets was enormous, even though the physical reality of such a sign was inconsistent at best. Not all first sexual encounters result in bleeding. But that didn't matter. In the medieval mindset, no blood meant suspicion. And suspicion meant trouble. To make matters worse, consummation was often a deeply painful experience for the bride. Many were very young girls of 12, 13, or 14, married off before their bodies were truly ready. They were expected to submit to their new husband immediately, whether they knew him or not, and regardless of whether they understood what was about to happen. There was no education, no preparation, no gentle introduction, and there was no expectation of pleasure. The goal was procreation, to produce heirs as quickly as possible. The bride's feelings were not part of the conversation. In some cases, this was terrifying. The young bride, nervous and overwhelmed, might be led to bed by older women. Her mother, her aunts, or the servants of the groom's household, who would whisper instructions or jokes or advice. She might be anointed with perfumes or braided with ribbons, dressed in white linen or simply stripped down without ceremony. Her new husband might be drunk from the feast or anxious or eager in ways that ignored her fear. And once the door was shut, if it was shut, what happened next was expected to be final, binding, and permanent. Among peasants, the process was less formal, but still bound by expectation. A peasant couple might share their first night in the same bed where they'd been sleeping for years if they'd been betrothed or cohabiting beforehand. Or if the wedding had happened quickly, they might find themselves awkwardly sharing a straw mattress in the corner of a crowded house. In many rural homes, there were no private rooms. Curtains, if any, might be drawn, but relatives were still nearby. In some households, it was not uncommon for other family members to sleep just feet away. The couple might wait until everyone else was asleep, or they might not. It depended on the custom and on the courage. Sometimes consummation was treated with humor. Guests would tease the groom, make ribald jokes, sing songs with double meanings. The bedding might be a loud event filled with laughter, clapping, even mock blessings. In some places, it was traditional for guests to throw the couple onto the bed or to deliver them to the bedroom with loud whooping. These acts were meant to be playful, symbolic of fertility and joy, but they could easily turn invasive. The bride might be embarrassed. The groom might be humiliated. What was supposed to be the start of a shared life was often a public performance, acted out for the sake of family and tradition. For women, the consequences of this night stretched far beyond discomfort. If she did not bleed, or if rumors began to spread, her reputation could be destroyed. Other women might gossip. Older men might mock her. And if her husband was displeased, he could make it known. In some areas, it was legal for a man to seek annulment if the marriage was not consummated. He could claim impotence, his or hers, or fraud. And if children never came, the couple could be blamed in ways that were cruel and invasive. The woman was nearly always the suspect. But it wasn't just women who suffered. Men, too, faced pressure. A groom who failed to perform on his wedding night because of nerves, illness, or inexperience might face ridicule. In rare cases, his virility could be tested in court. Medieval documents exist in which men were asked to demonstrate their ability to perform sexually, sometimes in public or with witness testimony. While these cases were unusual, they revealed just how tangled marriage had become with public judgment, far from the intimacy it pretended to be. And yet, within this strange and pressurized ritual, some couples found comfort. Not all wedding nights were traumatic. Some couples had known each other for years. Some had chosen each other, had waited, had hoped. They might have shared stolen glances during harvests, danced together at midsummer festivals, whispered beneath trees. For them, the wedding night was not a duty, but a welcome transition. The start of something genuine. But these stories are harder to find. They did not make it into court records or sermons or chronicles. They passed quietly from one heart to another, unnoticed by the institutions that kept track of property, blood, and heirs. There were also couples, especially among peasants, who had already consummated their relationship long before marriage. In many villages, cohabitation before official vows was common. A couple might live together for months, even years, before formalizing their union. In some places, a child born before marriage was not scandalous. It was just another mouth to feed. The church disapproved, of course, but life had its own rules. People followed them as best they could. And sometimes, the wedding night was not a first act, but simply a continuation of an already familiar rhythm. Over time, attitudes shifted. By the late Middle Ages, the church had managed to tighten its grip on weddings. More ceremonies were performed by priests. More records were kept. Consummation, while still necessary, became less of a spectacle and more of a quiet expectation. But the echoes of the old customs lingered in stories, in jokes, in fears. Even centuries later, in rural parts of Europe, people whispered about the wedding night like it was a testa. Final judgment that would define everything that came after that. So, what was the wedding night, really? A sacred moment? A cultural pressure? A legal necessity? A terrifying experience for girls too young to understand what was happening? Or just another part of medieval life, muddy, awkward, and imperfect? Perhaps it was all of those things. A. Ritual built on expectations. A tradition shaped by anxiety. A human moment wrapped in fabric too heavy for those expected to wear it. And when morning came, the bride rose with a sore body, the groom with a pounding head, and the village with news stories. The sheets were hung. The priest took notes. And the couple, now joined in the eyes of family, church, and law, stepped out into a world that had changed them forever, even if they had never really been asked. Dowries, bride prices, and the economics of marriage. To understand medieval weddings, one must leave behind the romantic notions of flowers and moonlight and step into a world where coin, land, and livestock held more power than love ever did. For in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't just a ceremony, it was a transaction. A quiet, solemn contract written not in ink, but in money, property, and obligation. At the center of this system were two deeply rooted financial customs: the dowry and the bride price. These were not optional. They were essential, expected, and carefully calculated. And for most families, they determined whether a wedding could happen at all. The dowry was the portion of wealth that a bride's family provided when she married. It could take many forms: coins, cows, bolts of cloth, tools, or even a small plot of land. It was meant to support the new household and symbolize the bride's contribution to the union. But beneath that symbolic meaning lay something grimmer. The dowry often acted as compensation. It helped offset the cost of taking a woman into another household. She would not bring strength for plowing or the ability to fight in war, at least in the eyes of the time. But she could bring resources which would help the groom's family accept her presence, her upkeep, and the expectation of future children. Dowries could range from humble to enormous. A peasant's daughter might bring a second-hand blanket and a goat. A noblewoman, on the other hand, might arrive with gold, silver plate, jewelry, land deeds, and chests full of linen. In some royal marriages, the dowry was so vast that it changed the balance of power between kingdoms. Dowries were not gifts. They were bargaining chips, and families fought hard over them. If a groom's family didn't consider a dowry sufficient, they might refuse the match entirely. If the dowry was late or unpaid, the marriage could fall apart. The amount of a dowry could affect how a woman was treated after the wedding, how much control she had, how much respect she received, and what kind of future awaited her in many regions. The dowry also served as security for the bride. If her husband died, she was entitled to get her dowry back, at least in theory. It was meant to keep her from falling into poverty or dependence on her husband's family. But this didn't always work in practice. Records show many widows fighting in court to reclaim their dowries from in-laws who had no intention of returning them. Some women were left with nothing, forced to return to their parents' home if they still had one or enter a convent. So the dowry, while often spoken of as a woman's safety net, could just as easily become a tool of control. The bride price, meanwhile, was the mirror image of the dowry. It was money or goods paid by the groom or his family to the bride's family. This wasn't a reward. It was effectively payment for the transfer of a daughter. In areas where the bride price was customary, it acknowledged the loss of labor and presence that the family would suffer. A daughter might have helped. In the fields, managed animals, or taking care of younger siblings, her absence mattered. And so the groom's family was expected to compensate the bride's parents for losing her dot in some places. Both dowry and bride price existed side by side, creating an elaborate financial exchange. Wealth moved in multiple directions, goods. To the groom, money to the bride's father, and sometimes gifts to the priest or the local lord overseeing the transaction. These deals were often negotiated in advance, long before the couple ever saw the wedding altar. Parents haggled over values, listed items, and promised delivery dates. These were not gentle discussions. They were closer to business deals, and feelings were not always spared. This economic system deeply affected the age and autonomy of the bride. A family that struggled financially might marry off a daughter early, especially if a good bride price was offered. A noble family might delay marriage until they could assemble a suitable dowry, or until a more advantageous match appeared. A poor family might accept a lesser match if the man was willing to forego a dowry altogether. In all cases, the bride's own preferences were often irrelevant. Her value was not measured by affection, but by her economic weight. Some women resisted. In this system, stories exist fragmented of women who ran away to avoid being sold into a marriage. Some fled to convents where they could claim sanctuary. Others eloped, forcing the marriage into being before their fathers could stop them. But many women had no choice. The pressure from family, church, and society was immense. A woman who refused a match might be labeled disobedient, ungrateful, or even cursed. And without marriage, she risked becoming a burden, a mouth to feed with no dowry to offer. This was especially true among the middling classes, where social standing was fragile. A merchant's daughter, for example, was expected to marry well, to help the family rise. A poor match could cause embarrassment. A delay in marriage could ruin opportunities. Every decision was weighed not just for personal happiness, but for the long-term future of the entire family line. Daughters were currency precious, yes, but traded nonetheless. Among the nobility, things were more dramatic. Dowries could include entire castles, forests, or revenue rights to villages. These marriages were more like treaties. When a noblewoman married into another house, she often brought power with her. If her dowry included a contested parcel of land, the marriage might trigger lawsuits, feuds, or even skirmishes. Her marriage could make or break alliances. She was expected to serve not just as a wife, but as a political asset, bearing heirs who could inherit both her father's wealth and her husband's titles. The weight of a dowry could also determine the status of the bride within her new household. A wealthy dowry meant she entered with clout. She could assert more control over servants, gain better quarters, or even challenge her husband's decisions carefully. Of course, a small dowry, by contrast, meant she entered with vulnerability. She might be treated more like a servant than a partner. If her marriage soured, she had less leverage to escape or influence her fate. For the groom, these economic arrangements were no less binding. A man who married a woman with no dowry might be mocked by his peers. A husband who failed to provide a bride price might face consequences from the bride's family. If he married above his station, he might find himself controlled by his in-laws, indebted and powerless. And if he failed to produce heirs well, the money might flow back to the bride's relatives, leaving him poorer than before. This system also created legal tangles. If a couple separated rare but possible, who kept the goods? If the dowry had been spent, did the bride's family have any recourse? If the groom died without children, did the bride return to her natal home or remain as a dependent in his household? Courts across medieval Europe were flooded with cases involving marriage debts, dowry disputes, and unpaid bride prices. The marriage might be over, but the financial obligations endured for years. And crucially, dowries made girls valuable targets. A young woman known to be carrying a large dowry could attract unwanted suitors, men more interested in her property than her personality. Some were tricked into marriage under false pretenses. Others were forced into unions to protect the family estate. A few were kidnapped, spirited away, and married in haste so that her dowry couldn't be redirected. It sounds like a plot from a medieval ballad, but these stories are very real, and they reveal how precarious a woman's financial worth could make her life despite all this. The system endured for centuries. Parents continued to save and bargain, arranging marriages not just out of duty, but with a quiet hope that their child might be treated better if enough coin changed hands. Some dowries became generous gifts, allowing couples to build real households. Some bride prices created lasting bonds between families. In the best cases, the economic part of marriage served as a kind of practical scaffolding, helping love and partnership to grow. But too often, these transactions crushed love before it could begin. The marriage was decided long before feelings entered the picture. The couple were pawns in a larger financial story, traded, positioned, and bound by decisions made in back rooms and whispered negotiations. And once the vows were said and the payments exchanged, the couple was left to build a life on whatever reigned. Some managed, many didn't. And across the centuries, in stone cottages and crumbling halls, the echoes of those arrangements lingered dowries. Locked in chests, bride prices buried beneath the hearth, and young brides, heavy with obligation, staring quietly into their new, uncertain futures. Annulments, divorce, and the cost of escaping marriage in a world where marriage was as binding as iron, where two people were joined not only by vows, but by God, church, family, land, and money. What happened when that union failed? What happened when the match that was supposed to last a lifetime didn't? The short answer in medieval Europe was very little, at least not easily, and not without great cost. The longer answer is one of heartbreak, bureaucracy, theology, and the creeping reality that once two people were locked into marriage, there was almost no way out. The church ruled over the laws of marriage. And by the high medieval period, it had made its view perfectly clear. Marriage was indissoluble. Once a marriage was valid and consummated, it could not be broken, not by regret, not by cruelty, not even by violence. You were bound together until death, or until one of you could manage to prove that the marriage should never have happened in the first place. Divorce, as we understand it today, two people parting legally and remarrying freely, did not exist. What existed instead was something slipperier. Annulment. An annulment was not a declaration that a marriage had failed. It was a legal argument that it had never really existed. A fiction and an illusion, a mistake, a clerical error in the fabric of God's plan. To obtain one, a couple or one person in the pair had to appeal to the church courts, often traveling great distances, spending vast sums, and laying bare intimate details of their lives. This process could take months. Often, it took years, and success was far from guaranteed. The church, in all its authority, had developed a long list of invalidating conditions, circumstances under which a marriage could be considered null and void. There were technicalities. If the marriage had not been consummated, it could be ended. If one party had been forced or coerced, that was grounds. If one person had been underage or mentally unfit, the union could be questioned. But the most frequently used and abused, it was consanguinity. The idea that the couple was too closely related by blood by modern standards. This might mean siblings or cousins. But in the Middle Ages, the church's definition stretched much further. In some periods, marriage was forbidden between anyone within 7 degrees of kinship, a measure so broad that it could disqualify half the population of a village. This restriction wasn't enforced consistently, but it gave the church a powerful lever. A couple in trouble could suddenly discover, helped along by lawyers or clergy, that they were distant cousins, and that was enough. At least, if the church agreed that the trick, of course, was persuasion. The church did not grant annulments lightly. They were supposed to be rare exceptions, not everyday remedies. But if you had money, influence, or connections, your odds increased dramatically. Nobles and royals exploited the process to escape political alliances that no longer suited them. Kings married girls for treaties, then petitioned for annulments when they wanted better heirs or richer lands. These cases were often theatrical, involving elaborate claims of hidden betrothals, secret relatives, or lies told at the altar. One of the most famous annulment cases in history involved King Louis, VII of France, and Eleanor of Aquitaine. They had been married for over a decade, had 2 daughters, and yet Louis sought an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, despite the fact that their blood relationship had been known from the start. The real issue was that Eleanor had not provided a male heir, and Louis had grown weary. The annulment was granted, and Eleanor promptly married Henry II of England, taking with her a vast territory and plunging Europe into decades of political drama. For peasants and commoners, the rules were the same, but the outcomes were very different. A poor woman trapped in a brutal marriage had little hope of escaping. Even if her husband beat her, cheated on her, or abandoned her, she could not remarry unless the church officially declared the marriage null. And the church was slow to do so. The process required money for scribes, travel, and clerical attention. And even when granted, annulment didn't always bring happiness. A woman declared never married might still be seen as tainted. As a failed wife or a troublemaker, in small communities, reputation was everything in the absence of annulment. Some couples simply separated informally, unofficially. They lived apart. They avoided each other. In some places, the church permitted a form of legal separation called separation from bed and board. This allowed spouses to stop living together, usually on the grounds of abuse or neglect. But they were still technically married. Neither could remarry. They remained tied in the eyes of the church, floating alone in a kind of marital and so many people stayed, not because they were happy, but because they had no escape. There are stories, quiet ones, of women who fled, men who vanished, of couples who simply walked away, abandoning the legal framework and starting over elsewhere. But this was dangerous. Bigamy was a crime. A person caught marrying again while their first spouse lived could face public penance, imprisonment, or worse. The shame alone could destroy a family. And so even those who ran carefully changing names, hiding pasts, pretending in towns and cities, particularly as the later Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, things began to shift. Some secular courts began to challenge the church's monopoly over marriage law. They allowed local judges to settle marital disputes, issue rulings on abandonment, and even grant annulments based on more practical grounds. But these changes were slow, uneven, and heavily resisted by ecclesiastical authorities. The idea that marriage could end by choice, not by death, remained radical. Even inside marriages, the constraints were stifling. Adultery, for example, was a serious offense, but not always equally punished. A woman caught cheating might be whipped, locked up, or executed, depending on her rank and the age of her husband. A man, by contrast, often faced no legal penalty, especially if his mistress was unmarried. The double standards were brutal, and the church's moralizing, while often stern, rarely disrupted the patriarchal power that men wielded over their wives. For women in unhappy unions, the only truly acceptable escape was to take the veil too. Enter a convent and become a nun. But even this required permission, and often the consent of the husband. Only with his approval could she be released from the marriage bond. Some women feigned piety to escape. Others truly found solace in the cloister, but the path was narrow, and once inside, the door rarely opened again. Among the wealthy, the option of papal dispensation, special permission from the Pope, was another route. With the right connections, a person could obtain permission to remarry, even after an irregular union. But this was not mercy, it was politics. The Pope granted favors where it suited him. A noble house might gain a powerful ally. A king might offer military support. And in return, the church would rewrite the story declaring invalid what it once blessed. Injustice was smoothed over with gold leaf and incense. And all the while, the people, peasants, merchants, laborers, servants remained trapped in marriages that had long ago soured. For them, marriage was a duty. A roof, a partner. In work, love was secondary. Happiness, optional, and freedom, almost unheard of. There are quiet records of petitions, letters written desperation to bishops or abbots. A woman pleading to be released from a violent husband. A man begging for annulment after discovering a hidden betrothal. A couple asking to separate, gently for reasons of health or madness. Some of these were approved, most were not. And the stories behind them disappeared, folded into the fog of time. So when we look back at medieval weddings, we must not stop at the altar. We must follow the couple home into their shared bed, their common field, their cold hearth, and ask what happened after. And for many, what happened was silence. Long years, shared burdens, faint smiles, occasional kindness, and the quiet knowledge that once married, there was no one doing it. Marriage was meant to bind souls. But in practice, it bound bodies, property, and futures. And once the knot was tied, it was tied for good. Superstitions, omens, and wedding rituals gone wrong in a time before science offered comforting explanations and before calendars and clocks ruled the days. People looked to the world for signs. They read meaning in the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the cries of animals, and the dreams that clung to their minds in the pale light of morning. And when it came to marriage, step as massive and irreversible as death itself, superstition ruled every moment of a wedding, from the date it was set to the shoes the bride wore, was haunted by meaning. The wrong gesture, the wrong word, even a sneeze at the wrong time could be interpreted as a terrible omen. And in the Middle Ages, when life was already uncertain and short, people were desperate to protect what little joy they could find. Especially when it came to weddings. To begin with, the day of the wedding mattered. Not all days were created equal. The church had a calendar full of holy days, feast days, and forbidden times, and couples had to tiptoe through it to find a date that wouldn't offend God or invite bad luck. The season mattered too. Marriages during Lent were frowned upon. Marriages in May, month associated with lust, chaos, and pagan fertility rites, were considered unlucky in many parts of Europe. The safest time to wed, often midwinter, strange as it seems. Cold months were thought to still the evil spirits, to make them sleep beneath frozen ground. Besides, with the harvest over and the fields bare, there was time to plan a celebration, or at least a small one. The weather on the wedding day was watched closely. A sudden gust of wind might mean arguments in the future. Rain could mean fertility, but too much rain was a bad sign. It meant sorrow. A wedding under dark clouds made some people nervous. Thunder, a very bad omen, indeed. If a bird flew over the ceremony and cried out, that could be a blessing or a curse, depending on the bird. A crow was almost always bad. A dove might be good. A raven, unmistakably grim. Some believed that if the bride saw a funeral procession on her way to church, her marriage would end in death. If she saw a black dog, her husband might cheat. If she tripped on her way to the altar, the whole union was doomed. And so people tried to guard themselves. They carried charms. The bride might sew a small piece of valfer into her gown to ensure strength. or wear a ribbon soaked in holy water to keep demons away. She might be anointed with herbs rosemary for remembrance, lavender for luck, or burned with a sprig of juniper, which was believed to chase off witches. Some villages had their own customs, tying bells to the bride's shoes, whispering blessings in the groom's ear, or hiding sharp objects under the bed to ward off evil spirits that lingered near the marriage bed. These were not games. People believed that the world was full of malicious forces, just waiting to twist a happy moment into a lifelong curse. And nowhere were those fears more concentrated than at a wedding. Even the way the bride dressed was full of meaning. While we tend to imagine medieval brides in white, this wasn't always the case. In fact, red was considered lucky in many regions. It was the color of blood and life and fertility. But blue, the color of the Virgin Mary, was also popular, especially for brides who wanted to seem pious and obedient. Green was avoided in some areas, associated with fairies and mischief. Black was unthinkable. Yellow meant betrayal. And so, with little money and only local dyes to work with, brides tried their best to follow these color codes, sometimes adding a ribbon of safe color to an otherwise risky dress. The bride's hair was another source of concern. Loose hair meant virginity, but also vulnerability. Bound hair meant control, but was seen as too matronly for a young woman. Some places required a veil. Others thought a veil might hide evil intentions. The entire ritual of dressing was tangled with taboos. Even the way she stepped into the church could change her fate. If she put her right foot forward first, that was good. If the left, bad luck. If her shoe came loose, the marriage would be unstable. If a child cried out during the vows, it might mean barrenness or betrayal, or worse, the groom, for his part, was not spared. If his belt broke, or if his tunic tore, it meant he would struggle to provide. If he dropped the ring, the bride would die young. If a dog barked as he said his vows, the marriage would be full of strife. Some believed he must carry a piece of iron hidden in his boot or sewn into his sleeve to keep witches from stealing his potency. And if he kissed the bride too soon, before the priest gave the blessing, it might offend the spirits, who were thought to hover around churches and wait. And so a medieval wedding already loaded with legal and social pressure was also a minefield of magical thinking. Families whispered over their shoulders. Old women recited rhymes to protect the couple. Children were taught not to speak out of turn, lest they jinx the moment. And the entire community watched for signs. Of course, no amount of charm or ritual could prevent accidents, and when things went wrong, they were not seen as mere mishaps. If the priest stumbled during the blessing, it meant trouble. If the candle went out during the vows, someone would die within the year. If a guest choked on food, it foretold financial ruin. And people believed these things. They remembered them. Years later, if a couple divorced or lived unhappily, someone would surely say, "We knew it when the wind blew the veil off her head." And then there were the real disasters. Stories spread slowly from village to village. A bride who collapsed at the altar. A groom who dropped dead during the feast. A wedding party attacked by wolves. A fire that swept through the wedding house. These became legends half true, half imagined, but repeated often, always with the same lesson. Weddings were dangerous. They disturbed the order of things. They invited fate to take an interest. And if you weren't careful, fate would ruin everything. That's why some people, especially in rural areas, avoided grand weddings altogether. They married in secret, quietly, with few guests and no fanfare. They didn't want to tempt fate. They didn't want to risk some forgotten sin, some invisible curse falling down on their heads in the middle of the feast. A simple vow, a shared loaf of bread, a walk around the hearth 3 times, that was enough. And if they were lucky, the spirits would leave them alone. But even in the simplest weddings, the old fears lingered. A dream the night before could ruin the mood. A bad omen, a broken plate, a bird flying into the house could make a family delay the ceremony. Some postponed weddings for months until the stars were right again. Others consulted wise women who read bones, cards, or clouds, and declared the day safe or not. And when the wedding was finally over, the bride and groom often thanked the saints, not just for the union, but for surviving the rituals that surrounded it, for getting through without tripping, without crying, without attracting the evil eye, for escaping the moment untouched by death or scandal or shame. And they hoped quietly that the rest of their marriage would not be as full of watching eyes and whispered warnings. Of course, real life was harder than any omen. There was sickness, hunger, betrayal. No amount of rosemary or silver bells could keep those things out. But still, people believed, because belief gave structure. It gave comfort. And in a world where the forces that shaped your fate were invisible and often cruel, the illusion of control through ritual, through rhyme, through superstition was a small kind of power dot. And so the stories remained passed down from mother to daughter, from crone to bride, a collection of warnings, blessings, and strange little rules. Don't marry in May. Don't trip on the way to church. Always check. The sky for birds, and never, ever drop the ring. Life after the wedding. A new kind of servitude. The vows have been spoken. The ring, if there was one placed carefully on a trembling finger. The bread broken, the wine perhaps shared, the ritual complete. The wedding is over. But what now? What happens after the guests leave? After prayers have been mumbled and the music has faded into quiet? In modernized, marriage begins here with the couple walking hand into a new life. But in the medieval world, the walk that followed a wedding was often less a journey of love than a slow descent into a new kind of servitude, especially for the bride. For a woman, the end of a wedding did not mean freedom. It marked the beginning of her transformation into a wife, a legal, economic, religious identity that came with expectations, obligations, and very little personal control. In most regions of medieval Europe, a married woman ceased to be seen as an individual. She became part of her husband's household, his responsibility, his property, and in many ways, his servant. Legally, the moment she married, a woman entered a state called coverture. It's a term that sounds soft, almost comforting, but its meaning was anything but. Under coverture, the wife's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She could no longer own property independently. She couldn't sign contracts or appear in court without his permission. Her voice was no longer her own. It was filtered through him and his name. In many places, she couldn't even inherit unless specific arrangements had been made beforehand. She could not leave her home without permission. And if she did something unlawful, it was assumed that her husband had either ordered it or failed to stop her. This wasn't just about law. It was about daily life. The new bride was expected to take over an entire set of roles, most of which she had no real say in. She would wake before dawn, often in a cold room with no glass in the windows. If she lived in a cottage, she might begin her day by tending the fire, milking goats, or grinding grain by hand. If she was lucky, she had help from servants or other women in the household. If she was poor, she did it all herself. And if she was a noble woman, the work looked different, but it was still relentless. Overseeing the kitchen, managing food stores, stitching clothing, balancing ledgers, dealing with tenants. The idea that a noble woman lived in luxury is mostly myth. She worked just differently, but regardless of class, the new wife now lived under constant observation. Her behavior reflected not just on herself, but on her husband's honor. If she was too bold, she risked being called a scold. If she was too quiet, she might be thought suspicious. If she wept, she was weak. If she laughed, she was flirtatious. The only acceptable expression was quiet competence. She was to be modest, obedient, fertile, and above all, loyal. And if she failed, the punishments weren't just social. In some villages, a wife who disobeyed her husband could be subjected to public humiliation. She might be paraded with a scold's bridle and iron device fixed to the head and mouth, or sent to the stocks, or simply beaten at home with no legal recourse. Wives had no protection against domestic violence. A husband could discipline his wife in private as long as it didn't lead to death or permanent injury. And even then, the consequences were minimal. Marriage then was not a soft landing. It was a new hierarchy with the husband as lord and the wife as subject, but it wasn't only the woman who changed. The man, too, was transformed by marriage. He was now expected to be the provider, the protector, and the spiritual head of the household. He bore the responsibility of his wife's behavior, her piety, and her productivity. If she failed, it reflected poorly on him. If she didn't bear children, it was seen as a divine punishment or a sign of hidden sin. You might be shamed by the community or whispered about in the churchyard. And children, yes, they were expected quickly. A wife was supposed to become pregnant within a year. If she didn't, both she and her husband came under suspicion. Maybe they hadn't consummated the marriage properly. Maybe one of them was cursed. Maybe God was punishing them. Remedies were sought: herbs, prayers, pilgrimages. In some cases, people turned to folk magic, asking midwives or cunning women for help. In extreme cases, the couple could even be examined by clergy to see if something was physically or spiritually wrong. But the arrival of children didn't ease the burden. It added to it. A woman now had another full-time job, motherhood, stacked on top of everything else. And children in the Middle Ages didn't mean joy and comfort, they meant risk. Infant mortality was brutally high. A woman might bear 5, 10, even 15 children in her lifetime and lose most of them. Every birth carried the threat of death. Childbed fever, hemorrhage, obstructed labor, there were no effective medical interventions. Many women went into labor knowing they might never leave the bed again. Still, she was expected to keep going, to get back to work, to care for the child if it survived, or prepare for burial if it didn't. Grief was rarely allowed to pause. The grind of daily survival. And what of the relationship between husband and wife? Did love grow? Sometimes. But affection was often a secondary concern. The couple had been brought together by economics, duty, or family negotiation. If they learned to like each other, that was a blessing. If they didn't, they simply had to manage. The husband might spend much of his time away from the fields, from the shop, from the manor. The wife stayed home, ran the household, and obeyed. Marital intimacy was expected, but not necessarily tender. In many regions, a wife could not legally refuse her husband's demands. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime. It was seen as a husband's right. If the woman resisted, she might be punished. The church taught that women owed obedience in all things, as the church is subject unto Christ. So, too, the wife must be to her husband. And this obedience extended to the bedroom, regardless of her feelings. Still, within these grim realities, small tendernesses did exist. There are letters, rare but poignant, in which medieval husbands express affection for their wives. There are poems written by women mourning lost husbands or praying for their safety. In daily life, some couples found ways to laugh together, to support each other, to build something gentle amid the harshness. But these were exceptions, not guarantees. And if the marriage soured, if the husband was cruel, the wife bitter, the home full of resentment, there was little hope. Divorce was nearly impossible. Legal separation was rare. The couple was bound and the household had to function. In many homes, this meant quiet misery. 2 people living side by side, barely speaking, carrying out their duties with dull efficiency. Children growing up in tension. Neighbors pretending not to notice. So for a bride. The wedding day was not the start of joy. It was often the end of freedom. She might have laughed with sisters by the fire the night before. She might have wandered fields, helped at market, flirted shyly at festivals. But once married, she belonged to someone. Her name might change. Her clothes might change. Her posture would certainly change. She was now a wife, and everything that came next, good or bad, was to be endured within that role. Some women thrived, finding satisfaction in work, in children, in faith. Some rebelled quietly or boldly, risking scandal to pursue their own path. Some faded into routine. And some simply disappeared from the records, their lives reduced to birth dates, marriage contracts, and death entries in parish books. So much of what happened after the wedding remains hidden tucked between church registers and household accounts. But we can imagine it, the sound of water being fetched, the creak of floorboards under tired feet, a woman at the hearth, stirring, porridge, thinking of her mother, a man outside, sharpening a plow blade, wondering if this is the life he wanted. Two people, bound by custom and expectation, trying to make something human out of a contract that neither truly chose. In the end. Life after a medieval wedding was rarely a honeymoon. It was a return to labor, to hierarchy, to survival. A new role to play in the long, strange theater of medieval life, and so the bells that once rang in celebration would grow quiet. The garlands would wither, the guests would forget, and the bride would begin her real work, not of joy, but of endurance, widowhood, or marriage, and the unspoken freedoms in the end. For many medieval women, the only true freedom came not with marriage, but with its conclusion, not by annulment or separation, both rare and painful, but through widowhood. It may sound grim to modern ears, but in a world where a woman's identity was legally, socially, and spiritually absorbed into, her husband's widowhood was strangely liberating. It wasn't just an ending. It was a quiet beginning,